In the late 2nd century AD, the Roman emperor was Commodus, and he would frequently enter the gladiatorial arena and kill animals in front of the Roman mob. Our historian Cassius Dio was also a member of the Senate, and so he saw these entertainments firsthand. On one such occasion, Cassius Dio says of Emperor Commodus that he descended to the arena from his place above and cut down all the domestic animals that approached him, and some also that were led up to him, or were brought before him in nets. But in a more striking moment, the emperor threatened the lives of the senators. When he approached their section of the stands, Cassius Dio writes, having killed an ostrich and cut off its head, he came up to where we were sitting, holding the head in his left hand, and in his right hand raising aloft his bloody sword. And though he spoke not a word, yet he wagged his head with a grin, indicating that he would treat us in the same way. Here we have an imperial menace, purposing to work a bane of fear on these men of the Senate. But this bloody gesture was not the cause of any dread, but of laughter. In a surreal image of civic intercourse, Cassius Dio tells us that the senators were so overcome with contagious giggling that they had to disguise their laughter by chewing leaves, so the jolly motion of their mouths might be excused. In reacting thus cheerful, despite the threat offered against them, the senators showed a trait conformable with the thoughts of Seneca, which counseled levity against evil. Seneca wrote that all the vices are not hateful, but ridiculous. It is more human to laugh at life than to lament over it. So even when confronted with the rankest evil, the Stoic bids us to laugh in its face. So Seneca writes many essays addressing the proper attitude of the wise man, but since we are focused on his idea that we should laugh at vice, let's start with this quote about the sort of person who is offended into anger when they are insulted. Seneca writes, "Oh, what laughter should such things draw! With what satisfaction should a man's mind be filled when he contrasts his own repose with the unrest into which others blunder!" That it's an amusing thing when wisdom is set in contrast against vice is well to be remembered in reading the story of Mercury and Battus in Book 2 of Ovid's Metamorphoses. We meet Battus in this story, a herdsman of Pylos, as the only witness to a theft. For all he saw, it was Mercury who had stolen some cattle. The god perceiving this, he found Battus readily agreeable to keep the secret in exchange for a cow, but Ovid narrates the ensuing blunder. So Jupiter's son pretended to leave, but he soon returned, in another guise, with a different voice. "Hey, herdsman, I need your help. Have you seen any cattle passing along this way? They are stolen. Out with the truth. If you tell me, I'll give you a cow for reward, with her bull thrown into the bargain." Old Battus couldn't resist this double offer. "You'll find them there, at the foot of those mountains," he said, which was where they were. Now, Mercury has found in Battus, granting me a Pindaric word alteration, an uncompuncted traitor, a man whose initial bribe swallowing may have been a commonplace indiscretion and contrary to law. The second indiscretion was contrary to his own word. So he's therefore a person with a generally disloyal character who finds no authority to be so august, neither law nor bond, but he will violate it. And yet Mercury doesn't bother getting angry with him, or with letting loose some heavy sigh for the cruel world, but instead he gets a good chuckle in his vengeance. Ovid writes, "Mercury gloatingly laughed. 'Would you show me up to myself, you treacherous bastard?' Me to myself." And the ensuing metamorphosis has meaning too. He turned the liar into a hard flint rock, still known as a kind of informer, the ancient stigma attaching itself to the innocent touchstone. Now, the touchstone was used to measure gold in ancient times, and its appearance here puts me in mind of a rebuke given by Socrates, who, when he was confronted with the iniquitous ramblings of a fool, was wont to reply to the idiot that in him he could not have found a better stone by which to assure himself himself as to the good health of his own soul. And by this, Socrates showed us that vicious thinking should be powerless to offend those who are really good. Similarly, Mercury's laughing reaction to the treachery of Battus is a chord in tune with Seneca's proposition that we not lament the vice we see in the world, but to make fun of it. Now, the poet Ovid bothers very little with plainly stated tenets of any kind. He rather lets the stories embody this concept through their comic delivery. And Ovid, it seems to me, is at his most satiric and hilarious when he is dealing with acts of violence. And a good example is the battle in the palace of Cepheus in Book 5, in which the hero Perseus must defend himself against the followers of this guy Phineus, to whom the bride Andromeda had been previously promised. His claim is highly dubious. He's also her uncle. So when Perseus finds himself surrounded by foes, he resorts to showing them the severed head of Medusa and turning them to stone. So just to align this story in the context of our thesis, here is an event in which violent men have seized on a groundless pretext to give battle and spill blood, and yet far from treating the matter tragically, Ovid devotes this passage to the idiotic postures in which each man is frozen when he looks at the face of the Gorgon. So let's look at what happens to this guy, Nilus. This guy's someone who's prone to boasting about his ancestry. Ovid writes, Nilus, who'd falsely claimed to be sprung from the Nile with its 7 mouths, and whose shield was embossed with 7 rivers in silver and gold, called out to him, Perseus, look at my family's founder. To have such a hero as me for your killer must surely console you. So he's pulling the old, do you know who my dad is? But Ovid continues, his final words were cut off as he said them. To judge by his open lips, you'd suppose that he wanted to speak, but the sounds couldn't find a way through. Right? So the braggart is frozen mid-sentence. Consider the question Seneca poses, what is more silly than the futile blustering of anger? And I like the word futile. Anger is a futile emotion. All right, so let's move on to the next petrification we're mentioning in Ovid. Acontius, a soldier on Perseus' side, set eyes on the Gorgon during the fight, and his body grew firm and hard as the stone crept over his frame. Astyages, thinking the fellow was still alive, struck out with his sword's full length, but all it produced was an echoing clang. As he stood where he was, dumbfounded, he turned to stone himself, with a face which preserved his expression of wonder in marble forever. So consider the surprised reaction of Astyages. He goes to kill somebody, but the guy's turned into a statue too quick for him, and then he turns into a statue himself. But thinking about it semi-seriously, if he served an honest cause, you'd think Astyages would consider this death to be a constructive part of war. But that he's flummoxed by it shows that destruction was his only real aim, right? He's got no instinct to exclaim, 1 down, 1 to go, guys. Get that constitution ready for the printer. No. It's, I wanted to stab that guy. So this moment is one in which the stupid intended killer finally, as the philosopher says, knows himself, and he's a fool. But there's something further to be said, and that is regarding the uselessness of both what he thought would happen and what did, as in whether he had killed Acontius as he intended, or whether he had struck a rock instead. The two deeds, in some sense, are the same, in the sense that neither has a positive use. But only in striking a rock was the idiot able to learn that he's useless to the world in the last second of his life. Now, when Phineus, the instigator of all this, is turned to stone and dies, he is similarly exposed for the baseness of his character. He repents of his violence only once he's realized he's sure to be killed, and so he seeks quarter from Perseus, only to be rated thus, Phineus, you spineless coward, no need to be scared. I'll allow you all that I can, a handsome gift for a weakling like you. So pausing there, to associate violence with weakness is also in line with Seneca, who says of anger that it is a weakness of the mind. Now Ovid continues to describe the death. With that, he, as in Perseus, quickly carried Medusa across to display her where Phineus had turned his quivering head. As the cowering villain attempted to shift his eyes away once again, his neck grew stiff, and the tears running down his cheeks were hardened to stone. But still a coward's face and suppliant's look were preserved in marble, along with the pleading hands and the cringing posture. Again, Ovid and Seneca would agree that the angry and vicious are cowards deep down. Seneca writes, whatever terrifies must also tremble. So that's good stuff from Ovid, right? My wife can marvel always what a chicken shit she almost married. So in all of these examples, it is clear enough that Ovid is painting a comic picture of vice. As E.J. Kenny says of Ovid, to read him is to be perpetually reminded of Horace Walpole's favorite saying that life is a comedy to those that think, a tragedy to those that feel. And Seneca has a very similar thought. He writes, we ought to adopt a lighter view of things and put up with them in an indulgent spirit. It is more human to laugh at life than to lament over it. Add, too, that he deserves better of the human race also who laughs at it than he who bemoans it. For the one allows it some measure of good hope, while the other foolishly weeps over things that he despairs of seeing corrected. So I'll just have to paraphrase what I gather from other parts of Seneca, which is that he associates utility and tranquility with wisdom. And by contrast, he associates uselessness and agitation with foolishness. And he writes, laughter, however, gives expression to the mildest of emotions. So considering Astyages, too late for the kill, striking the statue of Acontius, this is an Ovidian image of a Stoic idea. To weep over the fate of Astyages is as useless as the dumbfounded clang of his sword.